So I think it's welcome, everybody. I think we are live now, and we'll do a Happy New Year program together. I'm going to just double check and see. Okay. Not exactly clear how we are working, but anyway, um, I wanted to, just speak a little bit to this kind of time that we're in, this New Year's time. Uh, we're in the due north on the medicine wheel. There's a situation where, I'm finding myself sort of in a deep hibernation space, and it's an interesting journey right now. Got sick a little bit at the beginning, and then over the holidays, I'm just now coming back in. And for some reason, I lost my notes here. I have so much difficulty with this online stuff that it's kind of crazy, even though I'm doing it. Somewhere in here, I think it might be. So yeah, let's just go ahead and I'll see if I can cut some of this out. Sorry if people are here watching. Hopefully this is broadcasting on YouTube live now. And so again, Happy New Year. And we are in this due north of the medicine wheel, and we're, just completing these time of endings, and the old year is past. And yet the year is still just a seed. I'm gonna welcome to the Zoom feed. So hi Abby, welcome. Um, so yeah, so kind of coming here in this time of being deep in the ground like a seed, dormant and waiting sort of for the illumination and warmth of the returning sun. And I found that this year, more than even before, this time of pause has really been calling me. I don't know how much of it I got sick. I think it was COVID, so I feel like I'm still kind of in a little brain fog, and I'm just trusting in a way that it's fine to go deep into this space of um, rest, of not trying to focus, not trying to activate and do and carry a lot of extra stuff. So um, it feels like there is this sort of belly of the night, and that we're invited to enter and slow down. And for me, it has felt also like it's kind of the closing of a cycle for me. And I look forward in a medicine wheel that I work with, that's a kind of council wheel. And this coming birthday of mine in the spring equinox is a deep shifting from a time in what they call the Lodge of the Northwest, the Council Lodge, into the due north. And this is my third time around the wheel, so this is my last journey before, sort of having a perspective that they call wisdom going around the wheel. So it just does feel like in my life, some kind of completion happened last year of the sort of the projects, the completion of pulling together my understanding of the work that I do, and how it sort of is aligned with this journey that we're all trying to make. So I feel sort of like yeah, the initial stages have completed, and now I'm just sitting here holding this completion and waiting. And I'm not sure, if that's, I don't think that's the end of the work in some sense, but it feels like it's important just to sit in this waiting time. And uh, I think it's also maybe a time to conceive, to vision, to dream. But more than that, for me, it's to feel that inner movement of my soul that, will stir in its own time, for what, kind of awakens it for the new year. And I feel like I'm still in that deep place of rest and, kind of tuning in more to the unconscious, and allowing that to speak. So I think as we deepen into being, we can also discover maybe a new way of allowing our doing to arise spontaneously from that space of being. And so as we deepen into this time of the North, this time of pause and pregnancy, we can sort of maybe learn to nourish and sow the seeds of a new way of um, beginning and maybe learning how to be more in a flow. I think that's part of what this evolutionary and transformational kind of journey is that we're on. So, if you want to, join me in a retreat kind of situation, here, an individual retreat. And then I'm also scheduling a kind of small group hibernaculum retreat that's right at the cross quarter time, right before the 2nd of February. It's the 31st of January and into the 1st of February, which is, halfway through, in a way, the season of winter. And February 2nd is like this time of the real deep stirring in ground. And so we're still in this deep pause. And so if people, feel, like a call to be supported in doing that, we can probably do something. And you're welcome to just schedule a retreat consultation. But for today, I thought I would go into one of the pathwork lectures and share the pathwork. Has been a kind of path that I found in 1984 that really sort of began my journey of integration and healing and understanding for me, sort of a deeper metaphysical understanding of what's life all about. What are we here for? Um, and so it was based on these channeled lectures from a woman by the name of Eva Pyrakas, and she channeled like 258 of these lectures, and the being that was giving the information never really gave a name to itself. It became known as the Pathwork Guide, and it I use it most of the time. I'll go to he, but in fact, the guide said that there were numerous beings that were involved in bringing this material into the earth, and this was a while back. This was from 1957 to 78 when Eva passed away. But I found that this material still has a really beautiful basis in um, sort of this healing journey. It came in at that time, sort of saying that there was this new influx of light. And of course, that was the time when Eastern traditions were also coming into the United States. And there was, the first, blossoming of consciousness expanding experiences and stuff like that. So there was a lot going on. And so it kind of made sense that this material would come in. And it was what I liked about it was that it looked at the human being on this planet, struggling with the things that we struggle with, and how we develop as children, oftentimes out of our culture and from our wounds and that kind of thing, and yet that's still all a part of a spiritual journey that we're on, and that it can, like everything that is happening is in some ways part of this inner soul quest that our soul took on when we incarnated here. And while we forget, there's a kind of amnesia. We don't remember, what was happening before we incarnated. Um, that there is a way that our larger self understood and was involved in the creation of sort of the themes and the major events, and maybe the difficulties and also the gifts that we had and what we could bring in. And so it was the first thing. I mean, this was back in 1984 when I first found this, and I had read one other channeled material, the Seth material, and I really liked it. And again, I heard this channel saying that we create our reality, and we do it through our consciousness. But I didn't quite understand how, and I was really curious about that. So when I found the pathwork, I felt like it gave me more answers of, even though consciously I might want to create one thing, why am I getting this other thing, right? Um, and also, how to see that, like, a lot of what happens is that we end up getting split in a dualistic kind of space that is not exactly reality. Reality has polarities. There's night and day, there's hot and cold, but it was more like that in the Taoist understanding of it. These were balancing and moving um, differences that allowed creation to express itself fully. And we see this in the medicine wheel teachings as well. So that gets confused in our experience, mostly because we there's also pain and pleasure in this polarity, and our psyche longs for the pleasure and wants to avoid the pain. And by kind of focusing and chasing after one and trying to avoid the other, we end up creating a kind of illusory split world, and it never quite works the way we hope it to. So the Pathwork lectures talk a lot about many levels. So there's the sort of unitive and dualistic confusion, and then there's the way that the psyche tries to support and defend itself, and there's different forms of defense that we also don't really work. They help some, but they're not the real answer. And so life becomes a kind of experience of incarnating and activating, our sacred wound. And the wounding, I think is a part of the journey and is sacred. And in our culture, we tend to judge and reject that wound instead of really discovering that as a part of the mission that we brought in, uh, and what we came to work on and to heal. And usually through that process we also awaken and hone our gifts, and you know begin that part of the mission of what we came to help and to serve, and like that. But there is this part of the journey that kind of requires a descent. It's almost like we have to get lost in our pain bodies and our difficulties and our confusion, and then from there we seek in a deeper way that maybe we wouldn't ordinarily, um, when we're totally successful, or there's not a challenge or a struggle. The Pathwork Guide even says in our life reviews after we've passed, we'll discover that, our greatest spiritual advancement and development was often happening when we were struggling, and life wasn't so easy or so successful in the ways that we want it to be. So, it kind of takes a different approach to, embracing all aspects of what we're going through as just a part of a beautiful soul journey. And the more that we can sort of consciously partake in it and understand what's happening and not totally merge or resist in certain situations, then, we find a beautiful guidance within our deepest self that holds a kind of wisdom that can and then awaken inside. Um, so I thought for today, and it's a shorter lecture, so maybe we can get all the way through it. We might go a little longer than an hour or find a place to break. I'm not quite sure how that will work, but I did think I would just, share the screen, and we could. And what I like to do is sort of read through the lecture and sort of comment. Uh, feel free if you have a question to jump in. Um, and I'm going to work with. Let me see if I can bring the lecture up here. Oops, okay. Lost it in the background. Well, let me try to find it again. It's lecture 163, by the way, and you can go to that lecture on pathwork.org and look at it from there as well. But I'm going to try to share this. And I had it set up, and now, of course, okay, get a little bigger. And now I'm going to try to share the screen. Okay, so hopefully you can see this is lecture number 163. It was channeled on May 10th, 1968. And it's called Mind Activity and Mind Receptivity. It's really more than, mind I think is something larger than just what we usually think of as our mental, but it affects that as well. So I'm just going to go ahead and start reading. And again, feel free to break in. I will pause and comment at various places. She says, "Greetings, my beloved friends. The love of the universe embraces every manifestation and individualization of the divine being, especially when the outer separated self strives so ardently to find truth, the truth of being, the truth of self, thus the truth of life. All the pain and frustration the average human being goes through in the course of a lifetime is solely the result of not knowing your true identity. And the constant struggle of living comes from a vague feeling in your unconscious that there is something to recapture, some secret key that could open life. You know deep within that life cannot be merely what you experience from day to day or what it is at the moment. And so you strive away from the moment. And when you do so, you lose the moment and with it the meaning of life. For every single moment contains all of life. The struggle to discover the true self and to accept the now are not mutually exclusive. They are interdependent. Tonight's lecture specifically examines the mental attitude needed to unite the two apparently opposite ways of experiencing and to thereby find the meaning of life and your true identity. The mind's activity or lack of activity is the key here. It is a subtle process, almost impossible to put into words, and yet so definite and important. We must do our best in finding the right expression. It's difficult. He often says it's kind of difficult to communicate some of these things, and so we can, sort of tune in from our heart as much as our mind to try to follow what, this kind of finger pointing at the moon is like, so that we can kind of grasp some of these ideas a little bit beyond our regular understanding. And he says that way we can understand not only with our intellect, but intuitively as well. And this is a part of what we are really trying to develop, is this more intuitive way of knowing. So the lecture goes on, there are two powerful forces or attitudes in the universe, and therefore in each human personality. One is the force that is striving, moving, acting, initiating, activating, doing. This aspect includes self-responsibility, independence, autonomy, free choice, and the power of the self. The other is being receptive to and waiting for whatever is to happen. This aspect includes patience, humility, the awareness of interdependence, and of being a part of a whole. It has trust in the processes of the greater life. The former involves direct action. The latter means waiting for growth and indirect manifestation, which takes place in its own way and according to its own laws. So I think in our culture, we're sort of imbalanced and way more dominant in sort of the self-activating, initiating aspect of, being in life. And most of the time, it's like the serenity prayer that says, grant us the, you know, courage to change the things we can, and the ability to accept the things that we can't, and the wisdom to know the difference, right? And this is, a very powerful prayer in a way, and discernment that we're trying to make. And for the active ego, it doesn't even have to be or one or the other. If the activity can just pause a little bit to check out in this kind of more receptive state, what the universe is in this moment, or, that's where you kind of connect with your intuitive knowing. And it adds, a powerful wisdom in the process. But oftentimes we're maybe not comfortable with what we think is maybe happening, or what we don't want to happen, and so we're immediately jumping to, okay, well, how can I change it? What will it take to change this situation? And oftentimes when we jump to that place, we're jumping, from an unconscious place of resistance, of defense, of fear, uh, pride, self-will. These are the aspects of the personal lower self that the Pathwork Guide refers to. And when we're moving in that, from those places, it's like there's there's not a presencing of the higher self or what the world is seeking. Like there's a larger, unified process that's happening, and if it's affecting you, you're involved in it, it's working with you as well. But it's like there's this deep listening, deep inside of our own selves, as well as deeply listening to, the presence of the current moment, and where it's at, and what may be unfolding from within that. And so I find that, this place of learning how to pause, learning how to rest in patience and listen for a little bit as I get older, right, as well. I think this is more what happens naturally in our aging process as well, that kind of wisdom deepens, and there's a kind of, we've jumped before, we've done it before. Now there's just kind of like, okay, so let's tune in even more deeply. What is the world looking for in this moment? And so again, we come out of the kind of inner self sphere and into a larger sort of elder sphere of nurturing the world, of holding the world, of seeking to dance with the world as it's unfolding. So feel free, any comments, questions, and go back to the lecture for a minute. So when a person consciously or unconsciously believes that one of these two attitudes or ways of functioning is the right way and the other wrong, and we sort of have that in our culture, it's like, if you're in a pause, you're doing nothing, and you're not being productive, and that's not okay. We should always be active and doing, um, and so there's a kind of devaluation of this other state. And so, whether we consciously think it's right or wrong or not, the unconscious tendency will be to drive us into movement. um, we have lights on all times of the night. There's never any stop anymore. And so a lot of cultural pressure that also adds to it. And then time seems to be, getting shorter, or being filled up faster or something, because it just seems like people hardly feel like they have time to pause. It's like it's the next thing and the next thing and the next thing. So, um, again, I think, we do create, and if that's how we're feeling sort of this anxiety and this pressure to keep going and to keep going, like that's what we're gonna manifest. And so, in a way, in the path work, they talk about sort of these ways that we create our reality through our expectations and our generalizations and our unconscious ways of orienting in life. And they just, it's not that they're not true. I mean, there's certainly times when we want to act, but if we overgeneralize and say we should always be acting, then we lose the natural balance, the natural flow, the natural harmony. That is where a deeper creativity comes from within us. So, the let's see, where did I leave off? Okay, so yeah, so because it's impossible to use only one, the opposite of a person's adopted way of functioning is still going to exist, but in a less overt way. And when they're not balanced, each way kind of produces inappropriate, ineffective, and often destructive results. So again, it's often not so much what we're doing, but the manner in which it's being done, and this balance between the active and the receptive is a very central key to producing results that are sort of like, in a way, it's almost like the masculine and the feminine aspects of creation, the active and the receptive. And so, you are creating in balance and in harmony when those are, like both involved. And if it's distorted, then maybe the active becomes driven and overactive, and then the receptive becomes passive, or, sort of just resting and not doing. And so this is some of what the lecture goes into. So when they're not balanced, each way produces the inappropriate, ineffective, and destructive results. So it's important for the growing individual to discover the finely balanced interplay of these two universal forces. And since there exists no rule for exactly when and how to switch from one attitude to the other, the way to do so must be found within each person's own rhythm and inner reality. One must become attuned to one's inner life and soul movements, so as to recognize when and how each attitude is expressed, and when one or the other is predominant, and which is required at any given moment. The recognition becomes more and more spontaneous and automatic as the self unfolds and integrates with the ego. These two universal attitudes might also be called the active and the passive forces. I spoke about this topic many years ago, but on a more specific and general level, superficial and general level. Now this topic can be treated more deeply and specifically. You know that the truth of life cannot be found by understanding it merely with your brain. The way to experience the truth is to apply it first to your own self, to your individual problems, and in the application transcend the problems. And then you experience every force of the universe within yourself. Another way of putting it would be to talk about the creative masculine and feminine principles. The masculine and feminine principles exist in the psychic life of all manifestations. They are at work wherever life exists. The power of their harmonious interplay creates forever new manifestations and individualizations of the divine being. I do not refer solely to the fleshy creations. The principle applies to everything. Growth within the personality is also a creation, determined by the same harmonious interaction of the male and female principles. Growth cannot come unless the right interaction takes place between initiative and will on the one hand, and receptivity, surrender, waiting, and unfolding on the other. The joining of these two forces creates renewal, new forms, expansion. It bubbles forth more and more greater life. It creates supreme pleasure. This harmonious interaction with over or under emphasis on one force thwarts life and produces displeasure, frustration, and restriction. So when men and women have not established both masculine and feminine principles within their own soul and mind, they cannot fully be men or women. The two principles or forces. Well, let me pause here for a second. You have any questions or any comments that you'd like to make, Abby? How's this landing inside?
It's landing like it's just what I need to be hearing at this moment. So I'm loving every word. Thank you.
Okay, great. Yeah.
Just
So
taking
yeah, so the principles or forces have um, common denominators, and one of them is the alternation of tension and relaxation, of firmness and softness. The fertile soil of life, growth, peace, pleasure is the resilience that springs from the pulsation and rhythmic movement of tension and relaxation. This kind of tension is not the painful tension a person feels when the two forces are in disharmony. This pleasant tension is a springboard from which action flows both naturally and organically. The same applies to relaxation. It must not be confused with the inertia of lifelessness and with lack of energy. Its healthy version is full of life and inner movement, poised in the confidence that natural action comes in its own time. So, I found in my own life this has been a deep study, of the divine timing, when to share, when to say something, when to, and to try to hold, and be receptive, and then integrating that and then letting that, move forth out of me. And there is this way that I think we often feel like we have to figure it out or do it right or fix it or, control it in some way. And, I mean, there is this growth in it that comes through trial and error, so I think sometimes we want to control so we don't make the mistake publicly or something like that. But it really can't be learned except through embodied processes, through, the actual, experiences that it brings, and to notice within our own bodies, like how that tension feels and what is the difference between this pleasant springboard tension, versus this, sort of tense kind of continuous pressure, versus this kind of collapse into lifelessness with lack of energy, right? And all of these life force energies we can feel in our own embodied experience, and so we can learn directly in that. So, and then I'm an Aries, so patience is not my strong suit at all. So this waiting for the divine timing, this waiting, to receive the commissioning, in a sense, to bring forth what we have to bring forth. and to notice how that does happen in these moments, like like in these peak moments of flow, and these peak moments where everything seems to be just guided in that way, and we're like present and flowing with it. I think we can tune in, and we know that sort of, and this intuitive level of knowing that we all carry and are, I think, now learning and working to develop more and more. So, this, the more harmonious the life manifestation, the more integrated are the constantly fluctuating, initiating, and receptive forces, opening and closing, opening and closing. And the more the individual consciousness of an organism is removed from its source, the less it's aware of its true divine identity, the more painful must be the alternating rhythm and pulsation of its life. For wherever life is, the rhythmic movement of the two forces must exist. And so, like, I mean, this may be explained more later, but what's coming to mind for me right now is just, like we look at our lives and we say something must be wrong here because it's not looking like, we imagined or wanted it to be. And, the minute that we kind of actively uh, make that inner determination, that what is not optimal, or not what we want, or not what's supposed to be, or not how, you know, then, we're kind of now in opposition. The first part of this lecture, the guide says, like being with oneself and being with what is are very similar things. And so, we naturally, unconsciously go into opposition oftentimes to what is. And yet, it's kind of like the medicine wheel. We can't always be in the South in the summer, where it's expansion and growth and play and wonderfulness and all of those qualities of life. It's like that's a season, it's a part of a cycle. But life has to be a whole, and part of that wholeness is to balance it and come into the stillness of winter, and the pause and the quiet. And so, all of life is sort of showing us, nature particularly kind of speaks to us about this balance and this rhythm. And, then the more higher the development of consciousness, the more the individual being is aware of and connected with, the true identity, then the more pleasurable and blissful both the tension and the relaxation inevitably are. And the temporary challenges can become adventures and excitement in life, or when it's like just met as it is with trust, that what is coming towards us from the world, and right now it's a strong time to be trying to practice that, because a lot of things are changing, that and we're not, we like to be in security, and change feels insecure. And so we have some affected, or affected by this. And yet we're trying to find a way, I think, to like, again, if we're present, it doesn't mean we're just ignoring it. And if there's something we're called to act on, or to do, that can make a difference and help, then we're present, allowing that to come forth from within us. And yeah, we're not just kind of reacting in fear and resistance and judgment, and causing suffering for ourselves, for others, etc. So it's like it's always ongoing, this sort of inner attunement to which one of these states, the active or the receptive, we want to be working with. And I think ultimately we really do find a state that is a kind of, you know, mobility and relaxation. The guide has another lecture called that. And I think it's a kind of unification in the balance of these two forces, where, like there is movement, but it's not tense, it's flowing. and it's, aligned with sort of the connection to the universe and the inner intuition and inspiration. So that's, I think, this fabulous state of flow people really like, and talk about. So it's kind of the guide's description of it, I think, is here in these lectures. So I think I lost my place again. I'm just going to start here. Um, the two principles or forces have certain common denominators. One of them is this alternation of tension and relaxation, of firmness and softness. So we read that before, and this fertile soil of life, growth, peace, and pleasure is the resilience that springs from the pulsation and rhythmic movement of tension and relaxation. And then the proper interaction of tension and relaxation is the pulsation, the breathing of the universe, and of every aspect or particle thereof. For everything alive in the universe is an aspect of it and must therefore be subject to the same principles and laws. The pulsation of tension and relaxation expresses the integration of these two forces, the male and the female, the initiating and the receptive forces. Every life manifestation is an expression of this beat. The more harmonious the life manifestation, the more integrated are the constantly fluctuating, initiating, and receptive forces, opening and closing, opening and closing. The more the individual consciousness of an organism is removed from its source, the less it is aware of its true identity, and the more painful must be the alternating rhythm and pulsation of its life. For wherever life is, the rhythmic movement of the two forces must exist. Conversely, the higher the development of consciousness, the more the individual being is aware of and therefore connected with its true identity, the more pleasurable and blissful both tension and relaxation inevitably are. At a certain stage between these two extreme poles is the phase in which the opening relaxed state is felt as desirable and pleasurable, whereas the closing tense state is felt as painful and undesirable. The dichotomy causes the entity to strive away from one and towards the other state. Yet the more one strives, the more one hinders the natural rhythm. For the striving creates more tension, even when one strives for the open and relaxed state. Hence, there is really no other way but to endure the momentary painful state, so as to allow the natural rhythm to prevail until the entire personality is freed from the painful, cramped state. So, this is kind of the difficulty is we are always sort of trying to avoid our tense, cramped states or our painful states or our uncomfortable states. We like comfort, security, relaxation, expansion, openness, pleasure. And so, we resist unconsciously, habitually, automatically anything that's not that. And so it's kind of waking up to realizing that we're doing that. And to me, it helps to embody it again, to notice even right now, if you just scan and see like, well, where does it feel open and flowing and relaxed? And is there any of it that is still unconsciously holding? Even though I'm sitting here, this chair is supporting me, whatever, I may have my jaw slightly clamped or my shoulders slightly tensed or, my belly tight a little bit or something like that. And so, instead of, in recognizing that, it's like our tendency would be to, oh, well, let me, try to fix that or, make that change. And in a way, there is an invitation, but we don't want to do it actively. There's a way that we want to just say, okay, I see this place in me and I acknowledge it, right? I'm going to just be receptive to having, at least a part of me in some state of tension. And I just want to, integrate that, allow that to be a part of my whole. It's not all of me, but it is here now. And I don't have to fight it, I don't have to resist it, and I don't have to feel like it's every part of me or all of me that is like that. And so we can just sort of, again, in the self understanding, the self awareness, the self knowledge of who we really are, we begin to recognize that we're this awareness that is noticing all of these different tensions and flows in our body. And that awareness can be a kind of open, compassionate, curious awareness that, does not immediately, and maybe it will, but that's not the same awareness. You might have like an immediate reaction where you notice something and then you judge it or you resist it. And so, that's just something else to bring that open awareness to. Oh, I see this and now I see I'm judging this, right? So that we can just allow what is, again, to be witnessed and acknowledged. And what's interesting about it is when we do that, change naturally happens. And when we go in kind of with the overactive mind that wants to make change happen or tries to get it to change, or, thinks it wants to remember the next time and not do it ever again, it's like it doesn't really work that way. And then we end up sort of almost imprinting more deeply that part. So, it feels like it has to change, or maybe it doesn't want to change, or maybe there's just forces that are against that change. And so then from that pressure, it starts reacting against the pressure, and then it entrenches itself and it gets even more stuck. So there's this part of this work where we're, just learning to acknowledge and not resist what we find within ourselves. And also not to completely emerge with it, and think that that's all of us, or that's, our total identity. It's something that we're learning about and becoming more aware of. And that's, the part of us that is the awareness is really a deeper layer of the self. So coming back to the lecture a little bit, it's like this is how I take these lectures and apply them in my own living experiential, processing of life. And so these words come alive, within our own journey, our own process. And again, it helps sometimes to work with a helper in this. It's a very big part of, doing the path work. I, had a helper for many years, and then there's also, a beautiful way of working in groups that really helps us, see each other and ourselves in a more deeper way. So, but this place where we are just noticing, the tensions and how we're avoiding, you know, anything that feels hard or anything that, seems like it requires contraction or pressure. And then there's the opposite where, like, again, in this world, I think a lot of us, we're on, the Energizer bunny rabbit go setting, and we don't know how to stop. And it just feels like some of that is also, in a way, like, to stop means we would have to feel what's happening inside of us. And so the overactivity is a form of, trying to get past our own feelings. And so one of the things that the pathwork talks about a lot is that, this, way of trying to jump over anything doesn't work. We have to go into, through, and out the other side. And that's how that evolution in consciousness, is accomplished. And a lot of, spiritual, you know, practices are attempts in some ways, to kind of jump over it. And depending on, different levels of consciousness where you're working and what you're doing, there's many different forms of meditation. So it's not saying that all of those are wrong, but I think for the most part, most of us still are just trying to incarnate fully. And the longer that we live on earth, my sense is the more fully our soul is embodied in our in our bodies. And so that's a good thing, and that's where, we can start learning and paying attention to this, way that we can, contract against contraction, right? And so there's fear of the fear, and there's, like judgment of the judgment, and we do all of these complex and compounding things, and that just, instead of this kind of flow, it just locks everything into place. And so that's why it's good to, begin to experience, okay, so when am I, active and doing, and how do I feel about that? You know, and what is the type of energy in which I am, active? And then, can I be still? What does it feel like inside to just be, to just rest? And many of us get anxious and, distracted almost immediately as well, in that. So I have found, that it helps. I like nature because it's got so much there that it's like feeding all of the awareness and attention. And if I can drop into sort of a more receptive state and just receive it, that allows me to do that. And then the same thing within my own inner physical spaces, like if I'm conscious of my breath, and I can just, like watch the breath and follow it, and maybe sometimes it feels like I'm not breathing and I don't want to breathe, and there's no breathing coming, and it sits there not breathing for a while, and then a little breath comes, and then a big breath comes, and it's like it's all kind of this, again, spontaneous and naturally embodied process that it's not regimented, it's not controlled, it's not organized. And so I think the more we inhabit our body and work in nature, the more we also, feel and connect to that level of being. So let me go back to the lecture. Any questions, comments?
I was just going to comment on. I've always loved that expression. What we resist persists.
Mm-hmm.
But you added another whole thing that I hadn't thought about, and it was about the pressure acts against the pressure, and we get more stuck. That just really resonated with me as far as just paying attention to when I'm resisting something and just trying to be in that more mode of acceptance. How the change that I'm looking for is going, it's kind of seems not counterintuitive, but just kind of interesting that the more I relax into it, the more the change is going to happen rather than really pushing through it. That's actually going to make it worse. I never really thought about that part. So
Exactly.
thank you
Yeah,
expanding.
yeah, good. Yeah, I think it is in our culture particularly, it's like we're used to using the outer will, to get what we want done. And sometimes that works well, but the outer will can't control our feelings, can't make us feel like, we want to enjoy something, or it's like the guide says, love is not a commandment, it's a soul movement. We can't activate the heart with our desire and our thinking that we should. I should love more and be in my heart, or enjoy this more, or something, like we're confused about that, and it is counterintuitive because our normal way of doing things is to try to use the outer will to control ourselves. And I think it, again, is this dominating kind of energy that doesn't allow the life force and the natural aspects of our being to blossom. And that's really what we came here for. We didn't here really come for a particular result, I mean, we may have our ideas and they may be close, but mostly we want to find a way to, live our unique life as fully as possible, and to, experience that life, no matter what it's bringing, without sort of judging ourselves or life because it should be something else, right? that's this kind of radical trust that what is the pathwork guide is saying is actually an exact reflection of what's in our consciousness. And in that way, it may not be matching exactly the longing of what we would want, but it's like we can't arrive there until we work with where we're at and make that transformational journey. And so if we can trust that life is divinely perfect in each moment, even when it doesn't always feel that way, and to kind of seek the wisdom within it, and what is within us, maybe that is being reflected back. And then when we can again not judge ourselves or not turn against ourselves, there's this whole split where we have a part of our personality trying to control another part of our personality and getting very frustrated and angry, and this is the relationship that we have inside. And it's that kind of relationship is a toxic relationship, right? It's can't support the growth or movement. And so this simple way of sort of it's kind of a meditation. It's closest to what they call interrelationship focusing work, and you can find that online. And it can be a good way to learn this practice and get more information on it. I also teach it and do it in my individual sessions, but there is this kind of basic practice of opening to be with whatever is with you, and that develops more of our practice of being instead of the doing part as well. So it falls in a line with this larger movement of when we can really be in a flow state, right, where pleasure, I think, is sort of maximized. And even when we're hitting the difficulties, we're not contracting against them in a sense, and so we move through them more quickly. So let's go back to the lecture. Let's see, it's getting close to winding up, and we're only on page 3 of 9. So yeah, I don't know. I think I don't know if you feel like you want to stay, but I may just continue and make this one a little longer. I noticed that live streams don't always end in an hour. So
Oh,
um,
that's fine. I have extra time. I don't have to leave anywhere until about 1:30. So I'm
okay,
perfect.
well, we can at least go till then, and then yeah, see where we're at.
Okay.
Okay, so um, the dichotomy between the poles, of being, in the open, relaxed state that's felt as desirable and pleasurable, and the closing, tense state felt as painful or undesirable, causes us to chase after one and try to avoid the other. And yet, the more that we do that, the more one strives, the more one hinders the natural rhythm. For striving creates more tension, even when one strives for the open, relaxed state. Hence, there is really no other way but to endure the momentary painful state, so as to allow the natural rhythm to prevail until the entire personality is freed from the painful cramped state. Now, in a lot of therapeutic processes, right, we talk about, like going back and, telling our story, and, the trauma needs to, like heal through these, ways of sort of returning to the painful state. But I think most people are, not so comfortable just like, re-traumatizing or going through the story again, right? And so there's something a little key, I think, in this, where you might read it as, that we really have to go back in and remember how our parent used to abuse us or abandon us or whatever, and kind of relive that sense of like we've turned it into a story, and now we're aware of the feeling of aloneness and isolation, and we feel bad or we want to make them bad, or so there's all this complex thing. And it's like when we go in to try to work it, I think, at the level of the story and the memory and the history, it's hard. because it's all tangled up in there. And so one of the ways that I've broken down the understanding of, what the guide is asking here, that where we have to endure the momentary painful state so as to allow the natural rhythm to prevail until the personality is freed. It's like that state is still in your body now, in some form of tension, some form of holding. And you might, kind of get a flashcard, like if you're looking for a particular, painful place. Or you might just notice that life has brought you back to that place, where you're sitting now. And so, it's kind of like, well, what feels like, where's the pain in my life or in my experience in this moment now? And rather than, telling the story of it, can I just find it in the body and describe the sensation of it? So, is it pressure? Is it heaviness? Is it agitation? Is it, some place in me that just wants to cry? Is it some place that feels like a sharp dagger went into my heart and remains there? It's like there's ways that we can be in the present moment, feeling that pain now, and feeling it within the context just of, like breathing it and exploring it as, as it's here, and not kind of going and digging up all of the old grievances and the complaints and the, all of the story about it. And when we can, access it like that, and then sit with it, he says, like, that we can sit with it until the personality is freed from the painful cramped state. Well, what I notice, is like when I find that painful cramped state in my body right now, and just kind of breathe it and acknowledge that, and it begins to feel like it's, received, um, it will naturally start to change. It no longer, sort of feels like it has to hold on to this cramped state. And so it begins to naturally relax. And then maybe the body takes a breath, like a deeper, relaxing breath, and feels that tension just kind of leave the body. And that doesn't mean it may not come back, something triggers it again. But it's kind of like that feels to me like a more useful way of working into, through, and out the other side of whatever is, activating, or, fear, pain, resistance, like that, or unhappiness in some way, right? And often our anger, also, like what's underneath that is fear and pain as well. So, like, a lot of our feelings kind of boil down to the ways that we've learned to avoid or resist, uh, feeling the pure, simple pain of it. And the part of the reason why we haven't been able to just be with and hold and feel the pure, simple pain of it is when we first encountered that pain, we were very small, and we really didn't understand it. We didn't know what to do with it, and nobody was there guiding us with it. Nobody was helping us integrate it or hold it or resolve it in any way. And that was where the real trauma came in. Wasn't the event itself, but the fact that there was no wisdom guiding it, and we were too small to understand and work with it ourselves. And so we felt, way overhead, very lost, um, didn't know what to do, very frightened. And all of these things, add on into the trauma. And so, like, when we can sort of just sit with that energetically, as it still is buried in our bodies right now, and we can learn to tolerate and breathe and just listen to those feelings, states, those energies in the body, then they begin to, show themselves more, because they feel like we're listening and available. and a deeper understanding arises out of the connection to them, and oftentimes we, you know, develop a deepening sort of connection with our own inner self as well, which is a very beautiful thing that needs to happen for us. And so when we can just, be with, whatever is alive in us, and kind of focus not on the story, but just on the state of energy and, you know, information that we're feeling right in the body, then there is this movement that happens. And, it says freedom does not mean the cessation of the tense closing movement, for that would mean the cessation of life. It merely means that gradually, as the pain is transcended, it ceases to be pain. So as we relax around, the suffering, if the suffering needs to continue, it will be better, handled from that place. And oftentimes it's our own tension that's holding the suffering in place. So as we relax around it, it can lift. So it says many human beings find themselves in this middle state where one universal pulse is felt as painful and the other as pleasurable. So we're just also kind of in a more Buddhist way, trying to look at no attachment. It's, all experience is life experience. And if we can get out of our, uh, you know, resistance to pain and our desire and attachment to pleasure, our addiction, then we can sort of be in this state of maximum presence and, you know, acceptance, divine peace that I think that the Buddha was pointing to in his state of awakening. So the right interaction of the two principles or universal forces from the point of view of your mind activity and specifically your pathwork may best be described as follows. The outer deliberate conscious ego and its willpower must be poised in a firm but relaxed way. The resistant and destructive unconscious must be neither yielded to nor anxiously pressured or impatiently coerced, right? So the part that we're present to, sort of the self in presence is present in a firm but relaxed way to, this contracted, fearful, part that might be in defense and pain, might feel negative in some way, a destructive consciousness. And again, we don't want to merge with it. We don't want to fall into it. We just want to be present with it. And so the merging is like if we yield to it, or the resistance is like we try to anxiously pressure and impatiently coerce, and then we feel, a part of us refusing and resisting. So the ego must be alert to recognize what the unconscious expresses indirectly. So that's why we try to listen and translate, like, what is this, like a dagger in my heart? What is this, like, a contraction that feels like it's going to die if it has to let go? We learn to listen to these movements within us because they're unconscious expressions, and then we want to try to translate them. And we can then understand more clearly why it holds back, how it thinks it's preventing unhappiness, you know, uh, but how in fact it really does prevent more happiness and the unfoldment, the healing of the unhappiness. So to recognize the true unconscious state, the mind has to be calm, observant, and accepting of what happens in the now, thus encouraging the unconscious to express itself. Once the unconscious surfaces with all its unreasonableness, it can be quite naturally given a new direction, and the obstructions will vanish. Oftentimes the unconscious is just, it's like it's young and it doesn't see the bigger picture. And then when we can bring that young limited picture into view, like we recognize immediately, well, it just thinks this, that's not the truth. And then we can go in and from a place where we are present to it and we're not judging it, we're not forcing it or trying to control it, we can bring to it a deeper truth that really helps it resolve, inner conflict and confusion that it picked up when it was a child. So there's this kind of re-educating of these unconscious, more immature parts of our consciousness. The process requires a fine balance between the masculine and feminine principles. The firmness of purpose not to follow the line of least resistance when confronted with the unconscious obstructions has to be balanced with the waiting, receiving spirit in which the expressions of the destructive consciousness are accepted. The unfoldment of the universal intelligence in the mind is identical to this process. However, the more obstructions fester underground, the less will the unfoldment be possible. So the ideal approach is to use both alternately, to use both the receptive and the active alternately, to instruct firmly and calmly and determinedly the destructive part of the hidden self, inviting it to express itself, and then to observe what comes forth with interest, attention, and non-interference. And then to make this possible, we request the divine being that you are deep inside of us to guide and help us in this process. So in a way, that's really what we're accessing as more of our inner higher self, to be this open, compassionate, curious witness, that's present and waiting and listening and receiving, so uh, while we're waiting for the manifestation, like that invitation and that welcoming allows the unconscious more to surface. And that kind of open, waiting presence, that, a lot of focusing is just, sitting with it, breathing with it, being with it, until it gets clarified in some various way. We get an image or we get a deeper sense of the energy behind it. And and so this is part of this just receptive waiting, passive receiving function. And so the human mind is constantly groping to find the right balance of these all-important attitudes. Finding this balance is one of the great difficulties each person encounters on the path to harmonious interaction. The way cannot be learned by rules. Only finely attuned listening to your own soul movements will enable you to discover when to use one and when to stop and use the other of these two complementing forces. You must see yourself using the wrong way before you can gradually adopt the right one. So again, we have to just notice when we're kind of in our forcing current, when we're active and trying to move something and make something happen that's clearly not happening, and that just makes us more impatient or tense or, trying to force harder. So, to wake up in those moments and recognize at least what we're doing, if even if we can't. Sometimes I wake up in it and I can't still stop myself, like oftentimes when I'm getting ready for a function or an event, I'm kind of in the do mode, and part of me realizes, oh, I wish I was just kind of like more in a flow. I feel like I'm pushing myself a little. But if I have a time deadline, that's when it's the hardest for me to kind of trust and relax out of that. And so, we're all working with, different aspects of this, certain things that cause us to get more pressured in our uh, in our dance with life than really feels like the optimal. I think is this kind of balancing between the active and the receptive that we talk about as flow. So how often we humans are lazy and attentive to our innermost expressions, and when governed by a misconception, we don't always see it, or we just, kind of want to hang out in the passive principle, right? Like it's kind of what I've been feeling lately. I don't know if I'm giving into it or not. I'm going to give it a little while longer because it just feels like it's also part of, we've been so overactive for so long that I think the counterbalance, is we need to give it some space and see what happens. And, after another 2 months, if I still feel like I'm not, not waking up yet, I might, see if I can uh, look a little deeper or see if there's some kind of deep inner resistance, that's blocking it. But as long as there's enough, sort of flow that, what's necessary kind of happens and I can let go of anything else, then I feel like now is the time to do that and to wait, because it does feel like, okay, I don't know what I'm doing this year yet. I don't know what is going to call me, or what is calling from, you know, the universe to try to give birth to. So the vision is not alive yet. It's just too early. The seed is still asleep in the ground, and that's appropriate. We don't give ourselves enough time for that. So, um, there is another side of, some people can be very passive and sort of stuck. And, oftentimes we judge them for laziness or something like that, but there's something deeper going on. So that judgment doesn't work again. And so I would again start with, okay, if that's how you're feeling, like really embrace it, really acknowledge it, and seek to understand and listen more deeply. What does it need? Why is it feeling the way it's feeling? And if you eventually come to realizing, yeah, there's a part of me that's just addicted to sitting around and watching television and doing absolutely nothing all day, or you know uh, then there's a way that, again, it doesn't really help even with addictions to try to use the willpower and control it, right? So this is, I think, again, the right approach, and that active part is active in just seeking to deepen the connection and understand, and then more in the re-educating. Like a lot of times we think, oh, it seems so much more pleasurable just not to have to do much, um, and yet, if we really pay attention, we might feel bored sometime, or we might feel, like empty, and that doesn't feel so good either. And so then we can realize, oh, like there's a pleasure here, but it's admixed. There's never, 100%, and so if I can realize that, I can receive the pleasure, but I'm also sort of in this place of, uh, boredom, or, unfulfillment, then rather than, trying to force myself out of the stasis, it might be interesting to again vision, well, what would make me feel more fulfilled, or where is the life force and the value in doing something, and what would I want to do, you know, and what would feel good to do and pleasurable, right? So sometimes I think the inner child has gone through so much forced march and handling everything and being an adult and getting everything done, that when we kind of ease up, it wants to veg for a long time. And part of that, I think, is again, because it needs it. But at some point, vegging, like, okay, so what would be like really interesting to do, you know? And try to find something to awaken, or would be enjoyable and pleasurable, rather than, just the complete pause and the non doing. So, but if it comes again from sort of the inner longing and the desire, like when I do a vision quest out in nature, it's kind of interesting because, I'm not, I don't even have to cook and eat, like, so you're just there, right? And nature is all around you. And so it's this kind of totally open moment where you're just like, what do I want to do next? And I can close my eyes and take a nap, or I can sit here and look at the, breeze ruffling the leaves of the trees, or the sun going from one side of the sky to the other, and these are, you know, pretty passive activities in some ways. Or, maybe I feel an impulse to get up and walk, or maybe something, I look at I'm sitting in one place and looking at a rock, and then I want to go over and see what it looks like close up, or something like that. So it's kind of like learning to pay attention to what does call my attention and call my interest, and, seem, like something that the doing comes out of the being. I'm just resting until something wants to act. And then that action kind of flows naturally out of oneself. And I find a vision quest is a fun place to explore that kind of thing as well. Maybe I want to journal now, or maybe I want to go inside and feel into my inner being, or, kind of talk to the trees, and so you're just sitting there waiting to see what it is that you would like to do. And it's not going to be something, like go watch a movie, you're here in the forest, you're doing, you know, but in this moment here now, you know, what, where does pleasure lie? Where does the invitation? There's a way that you can just even scan the forest, and certain, aspects of nature kind of call your attention. One of the authors calls them natural attractions, right? And says we have like lots of natural attractions, even things like thirst and hunger are natural attractions for water and for food. But, we have natural attractions just like as we scan a beautiful, space in the forest. There's a million things, and maybe just one particular branch or one way that the bark is kind of like showing up in the light, or, something like that that just kind of draws your attention. And it seems like a deep mystery, and it can hold your attention for a while as you just kind of sit with it and kind of almost shape shift, if almost feeling like, oh, I'm going to go over and internalize or be with that, thing that I'm watching or whatever. So there's different ways that you can, you know explore consciousness in this, very subtle being doing realm in a vision quest. So when the weather gets a little warmer, people are also invited to come and try those things. So I'm going to do a little bit more, and then we'll kind of wind up about 1:30 here. Let me see. Um, says the human mind is constantly groping to find the right balance of these all-important attitudes, and finding this balance is one of the great difficulties each person encounters on the path to harmonious interaction. The way cannot be learned by rules. One finely attuned listening to your own soul movements will enable you to discover when to use one and when to stop and use the other of these two complementary forces. You must see yourself using the wrong way before you can gradually adopt the right one. How often I think I've read this, so let me scoot down. At the same time, how often are humans overactive, coercive, and tense towards themselves as well as others, misunderstanding and misusing the active principle? So we were talking before about sort of the misuse of the passive principle. And then he's saying, sort of the opposite, overactive can be in distortion. Whenever one principle is given such distorted predominance, it is precisely because the other also exists, perhaps less noticeably. So, like if we're, negatively balanced on the overactive side, it will mean that we also have a negative passive side. If they kind of come in pairs, like what we were talking about, if you're way overactive, then when you do stop, you just want to do nothing and stay stuck in nothing for however long you can possibly get away with it, right? And so um, they counter, pull on each other, and then from the passivity, you start feeling unhappy and unfulfilled and judging yourself and trying to make yourself be more active, and you finally get up and get back into the rat race, until you've just exhausted, collapse again. So it's kind of like this overactivity and collapse that we're doing all the time, and not finding this deeper inner balance for within ourselves. So we have to, recognize this fierce struggle. It has to be brought out and experienced and understood, because it's present wherever there are unresolved problems and wherever there is some kind of imbalance or unfulfillment, distortion in our lives. So the struggle between the self and the self is, for the longest time, projected outwardly, so that the struggle seems to be between the self and life, or between the self and others. But since there is no difference between you and life or others, the struggle is basically between you and yourself. And once you are quite conscious of your true struggle, the imbalance will become comprehensible and a reorientation can begin. True change is a spontaneous process that happens quite by itself, or so it seems. And, after doing work after work, and, in the beginning, the work was always sort of like, maybe I'll finally get there this time, it had this goal and sort of never arriving. And then, like after years kind of looking back and noticing, oh, I'm not doing that anymore. When did that change? Right. It's like, it does seem in this way to sort of be a mystery of how it actually happens. And it doesn't always seem to be clear. Oh, I did this and this was the result. But actually, it is the result of the unrestrained, natural, poised outer efforts. And when people expect direct and visible manifestations of their efforts to come immediately, again, they misunderstand the process. Such people become disappointed and discouraged. They start to use less effort or they try to use more, and then they, fall back into the extremes of the destructive pattern. At the same time, they become more and more tense and pushy towards their own processes. And if people wait for results without going to the trouble of investing their very best into life and the growth process, in other words, it's completely passive, sort of in a misapplied knowledge that growth is going to manifest effortlessly, they too are going to be disappointed, and the inner struggle against both themselves and life becomes more arduous. So the more unconscious your pains and frustrations are, the more you will strain and grasp for a solution. As you are not conscious of this either, you may explain away the feeling of discomfort for all sorts of reasons. You may even be driven to destructive actions, to seeking troublesome life situations that seem to explain your discomfort. Because not knowing the reason for a pain is worse than any conscious pain. And in some personality types, this can result in inertia. Misapplied will and action produce excessive tension, where the mind should be receptive, not only to what comes in from the outside, but even more to what comes out from inside. It often closes into a tight knot formed of pressure against the self. And sometimes you can really feel, sort of this internal self pressure, and it's very powerful to recognize that, and to see, oh, I am in relationship with, like, I actually hate myself, or I'm in this, judgmental forcing current, rejection of how I am now, and, wanting to be somehow different. And all of this is, a kind of misapplied will and action that doesn't go anywhere. Where the mind should be receptive not only to what comes in from outside, but even more to what comes out from inside. And so we're afraid also of letting our real self, our authentic self, just express. And that also blocks all this whole natural flow. So deliberate receptivity toward the inner processes. So receiving into consciousness what wants to work its way out is an essential part of the path. And again, we often are aware of something that's arising in us, and we don't think, oh, this wants to work its way out, or this is something coming for help and healing. We think, oh, this is my problem. I gotta, suppress it, kill it, get rid of it. And that, adds to this kind of vicious circle of spinning inside of ourselves with our problems. You cannot ever get to know what is within you unless your inner attitude is cultivated, welcoming everything that is arising, right? Not judging it in the least. When people are too impatient, their pathwork is stopped. Excessive tension is always an expression of misunderstanding the processes that are caused by the false idea that inner blocks can be removed by the direct application of the ego will. So again, we're confusing the tool to be used for the change to happen. The ego will has its necessary function, but it is only indirectly responsible for the undercurrents and the will of the unconscious. Therefore, the outer or ego consciousness must treat the unconscious, even the destructive, childish, distorted part of it, with respect. It is the respect you grant a being who must not be coerced, but must find its own way. Your own unconscious, too, must find its own way. If it is coerced, it cannot unfold itself. It cannot respond. It cannot reveal itself. If the outer mind is tense and anxious and forces the unconscious, it is impossible to establish a kind of relationship between the conscious and the unconscious that is necessary, to reveal the latter and unify the two. So this is the work in a nutshell, and we need to wind up here. But, if people are interested, get in touch with me through the website. There are some, online groups where we're practicing this process. And I do that in my individual sessions. And we also work with it in group and individual retreats. So, hope that this was useful and people begin at least to see a little deeper into sort of these inner processes that we're working to. That's the level that the healing can happen. Okay, thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Darlene. This was wonderful. Thank you so much.
Yep,
See you
take
next
care.
time. Bye bye.
Yeah, you too. Bye.